Hello, my name is Russell Todd from Sporting Heritage. Sporting Heritage is a not-for-profit organisation that supports the collection, preservation, access to and the research of sporting heritage in the UK and further afield. We have extensive experience in delivering programmes and projects at all levels, from the strategic to the local, in the heritage, media and sports sectors. Specifically, I lead on Sporting Heritage's podcast media and the production of that, as well as doing some facilitation and the like in Wales, where I'm based. Before I introduce my guest, this talk is part of the Art of Sporting Heritage Month, which is running throughout February 2022. Its focus is on the visual art, but all forms of artistic expression that focus on sport and sporting heritage are being celebrated via the sharing of collections, the showcasing of artists and specific artworks. You can follow it all on social media at the hashtag sport and art, on which we also encourage you to share your own collections, artwork and inspirations. So over to my guest. And it's a warm welcome to Chris Stride from the University of Sheffield, who, with Fionn Thomas, has created the Sporting Statues Project. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Russell.
So the Sporting Statues Project does what it says on the tin in some respects, but how long has it been running, and what are you and Fionn hoping to achieve with it?
Well, it's been going on just over a decade now. In terms of the website, that is approaching 10 years, but there was a year or so's work before that. The idea of the project came about when a colleague of mine, John Wilson, came in my office one day and he said, there's a lot of these football statues around. I've taken a few photos of them. And I'm a statistician and I like to know how many there are of something. So this sort of piqued my interest. And I started, well, let's see if we could make a list of all of these and we could write something about them. And I started trying to track down how many there were, and soon found out that actually the stories behind them were far more interesting than just making a list. So it just sort of spiraled from there, really, and became this big academic project, for which the website is the public facing part. But there's been about 10 or so papers, several magazine articles, book chapters, etc. as well, and lots of conference talks.
Well, I've got a bit of I suppose, an enthusiast's interest, maybe not even to the extent of sort of mapping them or looking at them from any statistical analysis. I wrote something for the Sporting Heritage blog. I think it was during lockdown. One of those things that you sort of did to keep yourself busy, I suppose, was a bit thin on the ground. And what struck me was, and what was the premise of that blog and the map that I kind of connected to it, was that, to a lot of people outside of Wales, where I live, as I say, rugby union in particular tends to be seen as the sort of the national sport, the sport that is identified with Wales and with which Wales is identified. And what struck me is that there's actually more statues of boxers in Wales.
Yeah.
And even when you count, all of the rugby-related statues, one of those is of an administrator, Tasker
Watkins, yeah.
Obviously played the game, but his prominence is more because of his military career and legal career as well. But it's his administrative sort of role and achievements with the game in Wales, not those on the pitch, as it were. So that kind of, to me, sort of, I don't know, I found that slightly interesting, and I thought that might be interesting to bring to the attention of other people. 3 of those 5 statues are all in Merthyr Tydfil, which, although not a small town, it's not a large town either. So that concentration, that cluster, suggests to me that it's saying a little bit more than just celebrating the feats and the achievements of those individuals. And I know we're going to be touching on a couple of those in due course. But as I said, it's the Art of Sporting Heritage Month. These statues will obviously have huge emotional value for a lot of people, fans of particular clubs, particular sports, specific sort of institutions, associations, and so on. But them as forms and expressions of art is something I think we'd like to kind of get beneath the skin of a little bit here. So where would you suggest we start then in talking about these statues as forms of art?
Well, it's a very contested area, the idea, to the extent of which they are considered art, or indeed in any sense innovative art or creative art, versus the sense to which they are reproductions of an individual, of a photo, etc. I think this is a challenge for sculptors involved in it, and also people who commission statues of sports people, because ultimately the people who are being sculpted, the figure, is a figure as a sporting hero who is very important to lots and lots of fans. And those fans would expect that recreation of their hero's image to look very much like their hero. And that takes out a lot of the scope for creativity. Where there has been an attempt to be more creative in terms of how the image of that person has been represented, which actually is not so much in the UK, but more in America, where there's been a few people doing statues with like multiple arms as motion blurs and things like this. There's been quite a hostile reaction from some of the fans. So there's a lot of pressure on the sculptor to make this image look as realistic, as like to the person that it's representing as possible. There's also the fact that for many years, I'd probably say between sort of 1910 and 1990, really, the idea of figurative statue, not just sporting figurative statue, but figurative sculpture generally, was very unfashionable. It was deeply unfashionable. The fashion in that period was very much towards more conceptual art, strange shapes, non-realistic interpretations of figures. And the resurgence of figurative art, which has coincided with sporting statues, has come very much at the time when a lot of art is funded by lottery money, and therefore councils have to be a little bit more aware of what the public want to see, as opposed to the arts officer in the council, as in someone who you'd assume is a trained artist, has a background in art, would actually like to see. So there's this tension there that I think a lot of people within the art world regard figurative sculpture, and particularly sporting figurative sculpture, as perhaps a bit cheap, whereas the people, the general public, they like figurative sculpture. There's been lots of surveys, and it shows their preferences for that rather than more abstract work. So there's this tension there, that someone who's a figurative sculptor is looking to satisfy the public's demand for a recreated image, and they probably can't put too much of their own ideas into it. That makes sense.
That notion of the recreated image is important, isn't it? Because several of the statues that we're going to be showing on screen in a moment are of individuals in poses that are, well, iconic in some cases,
yes,
or at the very least are sort of richly and deeply connected with an individual, how they celebrated a goal, that kind of thing. It's that physique almost of them, and that action of theirs that is synonymous with them, I suppose. But I guess that's easier to identify for people, because you talk about some of the more abstract. Each day throughout Art of Sporting Heritage Month this month, an individual sport is being focused on, and horse racing was one a couple of days ago prior to recording this, and there were some really interesting, and I really liked them, abstract artworks of horses and jockeys and the trainer and fans around the horse. But if I'm honest, you always had to put a little bit of effort in to kind of really work out what was going on there. Whereas seeing Thierry Henry sliding on his knees, you kind of know exactly where you are almost immediately. There's not much effort, whether you're an Arsenal fan or even a football fan, perhaps.
Well, we'll talk about Thierry Henry a bit later. And actually, that particular statue, even though on the face of it, it's a very simple interpretation, there are several layers to that. It's actually quite clever. Not so much with the image, but the way it's been presented. But yes, generally, a lot of sporting statues are based on particular moments, as you say. The idea of flashbulb memory, or even like video clip memory these days, where the artist is simply recreating a photo, and that photo is something that's already known to the public. I can think of particularly the Bill Shankly statue at Liverpool, which is from a photo when he walks in front of the Kop raising a scarf. And that photo was taken by the Liverpool Echo, I think, and it was widely circulated, and it's a very iconic image of him. So when they come to choose a design for a Bill Shankly statue, then obviously that's an obvious thing to go to. Not all sculptors work like that, though, to be fair. In some cases, I think if the sculpture is perhaps more famous, has a bit of leverage, for example, like Philip Jackson, very famous sculptor who's done royal family and big war memorials in the UK. Because he's a big name, Manchester United, big name, were willing to pay for Philip Jackson to do their statues. And when he did Matt Busby, that wasn't taken from a photo, any particular photo. He looked at lots of images of Busby and then came up with his own interpretation across them. There is scope to be artistic there, but I think perhaps you've got to be a name sculptor with a bit more leverage in how you work to be able to do that more easily.
Yeah. Before we get into some of the specific examples, is it worth clarifying maybe what the sort of the inclusion, the eligibility criteria for the data you've got? Because I queried this.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay.
Because I mentioned to you there's a bust of a head of the late Robbie James at Swansea City. Played for any number of Football League clubs: Queen's Park Rangers, Leicester, Swansea, Cardiff City, and Wales. There's also a statue of Ivor Allchurch there, but it's just a bust. So I sort of said, well, a bust's not statues, or so. Break down some of the terminology and where you draw your red lines.
Okay. So if anybody watching doesn't capture this is actually, I've broken this down in detail on our website because, again, as a statistician, I like to be precise about things. And unfortunately, what I have to do to include something or not include something is put a cut. I've got to say, I'm either including or not including it. And actually, even though you might not think so, there is a sort of continuum between a full-size figurative statue and then either smaller statues like figurines or indeed busts. You can get busts that are actually, well, a head and a bit of the shoulders, a half body statue. Do you include that or not? Well, there are grey areas where we have sort of gone one way or another, and you could argue we're breaking our rules. But the general rule we've had is that we're just going to include full body statues. The reasoning for that is this. The project is about public representations of sports people. Busts are generally things that are produced in multiple editions and often end up in people's homes or boardrooms, not in places where the public can see them. And I think that gives a very different interpretation to them. There are a few, like you say, busts in public sites, and some of those we have actually included. It is a bit of a grey area, I've got to be honest. But the general rule is full body, at least half size, figurative sculptures of sports people.
So if anyone's not happy, they're to write to Fion.
Exactly.
Fion.
My reply to that would be, it's our project, so we get to choose. It's worth saying we also include, it's not just specific sports people, we include statues of anonymous figures as well, as long as it's full body. So an anonymous footballer or anonymous rugby player, we would include that as well. And there's quite a few of those now.
Mm-hmm. And also, for example, the Git Neath Bran statue in the Cunnan Valley, semi-mythical figure, or a real figure, but mythical achievements.
Yes, I mean, he's of human form, so he would be included. Whereas, for instance, the ox at Oxford United ground is not human, and therefore he's not included. Likewise, we haven't included statues just of horses. I know there are many of those, and I've been really tempted to put Desert Orchid in, but I wanted to have clear boundaries. If you don't have clear boundaries for a project like this, then you can't have a sense of completeness. And for me, the sense of completeness was quite important. Again, not just with my statistician's head on. One of my reasons for doing the project was, once I started finding out about these statues, I looked for research around them, articles around them. And every time I read an article, it was always just about one or two particular statues. And there was never any reference to the UK sports statuary or the world sports statuary as a whole. There was no sense of whether this statue people were talking about was exceptional or it was typical of a type. And the reason I soon discovered for this was there wasn't any sort of general database that covered sports statues as a whole. So anybody writing about a particular statue couldn't say this is different or this is similar. And that was one of the reasons behind the project, was to create that sort of reference. So when I came to write about particular statues, I could say, yeah, this one's really unusual, or this one has other examples like so and so and so and so.
Yeah. Okay, so as I said, there's an emphasis on visual arts during art, sport and heritage runs, not at the exclusion of other forms of artistic impression, as I say. We've talked about a few of the statues. Let's have a look at some of those that you've got on your database, Chris. Where should we start? Can I maybe press you to start with Johnny Owen, the Matchstick Man?
Yeah, you can go into Wales first.
Personal favourite of mine, one of the ones I wrote about. So let's just get this up on the screen. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah.
If you can see it, Chris, then likely other people. So yeah, so here's your database. It's online. There's your header there, from pitch to plinth. Any number of links. Again, you go into a bit more detail about the eligibility and inclusion criteria. Some of the
you might want to click on the UK map actually for a second, just so people can see that. If you go across to the map, that's a bit of fun for people. That's the other way you can access the statues. You can either click on the database, or you can actually zoom in and look at Fion's amazing map.
Yeah.
Click on any statue and it will tell you about it.
Yeah, so
we're going to go down.
There we go.
That's Tasker Watkins in Cardiff, etc., and that links to the page. So,
and many thousands of people will be passing that.
I hope so.
The new stadium this month and next year, Six Nations, of course. Tend to cluster around the main sort of settlements, I suppose, the metropolitan areas of the UK. But to there, and as I said, any number of links, including sort of the contacts and so on. But if we go back to Matchstick Man, Johnny Owen, it's in the shopping centre, like an open air sort of shopping centre in the middle of Merthyr Tydfil, St Tydfil's shopping centre. Tydfil was a saint many hundreds of years ago. Merthyr is the Welsh word for martyr, so Tydfil, a martyr. Just to give you a little bit of a Welsh lesson there. Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about the Matchstick Man, one of three, as I said, all within a very, very small area as well. I mean, it's not just that they're concentrated in Merthyr as a town itself. It's that they're all very, very close to one another in the town centre.
I mean, this statue ticks a lot of boxes in terms of different reasons or different ideas around sports statues. Perhaps the one that may be most obvious to the public, at least those who know boxing, was that actually Johnny Owen was killed in the ring, or died from injuries sustained in the ring. So whilst actually, if you look at the UK sports statues, most of them were unveiled when the subject was alive. People don't realise that. They often think statues they commemorate dead people. Not the case, certainly not among sports statues. They tend to commemorate people who are still alive and their career was maybe 20 years ago. They're about nostalgia. Johnny Owen is one of those that does fit perhaps the template that people would expect for statues, someone who died in perhaps heroic circumstances. The location is classic as well for UK sports statues, at least the civic ones. So, I mean, boxing as a sport doesn't have dedicated stadiums as such. It's an individual sport, so you don't have a supporter base in the same way as you do for a football team that turns up every week. So statues of performers in individual sports tend to be in civic sites. I suppose you could stick one outside somewhere. like what's it called? The big hall in Belfast where I have a lot of fights, or in East London, but generally they're going to be civic. And civic statues are very much about, at least in my opinion, about trying to brand the town where they're located. And the sort of towns where you tend to get civic statues tend to be towns that either haven't got many other notable points of identity, or towns that did have notable points of identity through their industry. So Merthyr, traditionally coal mining area, industrial area, and suffered lots of economic problems with those industries declining. And therefore there's this need for some sense of new identity within the town. Now, if there's local sports heroes who people recognise, who can provide that, then they're obvious choices. Now, it's worth saying that the location itself, a shopping precinct, is quite a common one. I mean, it's a central place in a town. But there's also the fact that when high streets are redeveloped, I don't think this is the case for the Johnny Owen statue particularly, but certainly other statues that are found in city centre or in town centres, in precincts, they are there because there's a cut from the developers. Developers build a new shopping centre, they need to give a percentage to the council, which is then used for art, the percentage for art scheme. And that's often spent on figurative sculptures because councils know the public like figurative sculptures. And these days, who are you going to put up? If you're going to put up a figurative sculpture in your town centre, who are you going to put up? Well, you're not going to put up politicians, are you? They're not very popular. Religious figures, quite divisive. Even the royal family don't quite have the approval they did. Military figures can be controversial, but sporting heroes are a obvious choice in that respect. Sporting heroes and comedians tend to be our civic statues these days, rather than the old template of royals and politicians and industrialists.
Yeah, yeah.
It fits that template as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that Johnny Owen died from injuries sustained in the ring. He was fighting Lupi Pinto out in LA, I think it was. And one of the things I think was really quite touching with this, as I said, the details of each, a bit more of the detail around, who sculpted it. So James Doan in this case, when it was unveiled, so on, and what the inscriptions say. It's almost like a biographical detail of the statue. One of the things I learned, though, was that Lupi Pinto himself was invited by the family of Johnny Owen to come along to the unveiling. So there's something quite sort of touching around the process by which the statues are unveiled. They are, put into location, commemorated, celebrated, and so on. And I thought that was quite moving, really.
Yes, it's very much an event for the local community, and I think particularly the Welsh boxers statues. There's, I think, a Welsh boxers organisation that has helped the fundraising for these. A very tight-knit organisation, and they're quite a lot of money. You're talking 50, 60,000 for a full-body figurative statue, and then you've got to the cost of the plinth, the actual putting it on site, which involves a crane, and it's running into the thousands to do that part of it. So having dedicated people who are willing to fundraise and having a tight-knit community which will be willing to donate is a key thing. And you tend to find that with danger sports. Up in the borders of Scotland, there's several statues of motorcyclists. Likewise, on the Isle of Man, there's several statues of motorcyclists, most of whom have been killed in accidents. And again, I think rather like the boxing community, the motorcycling community is very close-knit. It's almost a subculture in itself. And with that sort of community, fundraising becomes easier than perhaps, say, raising funds for an athlete who's a runner or a cricketer. That sense these people are putting their lives on the line, so their fans actually have that extra bit of dedication because they realise what it's all about.
Because boxers often have their hometown or their home district region as part of their kind of their ring name, their ring persona as well, don't they?
Yeah,
Matchstick Man from Merthyr with Johnny Owen, that alliteration. I can think of Joe Calzaghe, Welsh and Italian roots, for example,
yeah,
was riffed on as well, and there's any number of examples as well. So we've got Howard Winston here. People will see from the backdrop of that it's basically the same shopping centre.
yeah,
It's around the corner, literally from Johnny Owen. There's also the sort of thoroughfare from the bus station as well. So it's been strategically located to almost engage as much footfall as possible as well. So not just be somewhere that's popular, but it's where people kind of come and go from. I think that's quite key as well. Anything to say on the Howard Winston one?
I think it's a very interesting pose. It's almost sort of magisterial, isn't it? The emperor greeting people coming into Merthyr, whereas Johnny Owen was this live wire little figure. Howard Winston is somehow more solid, and he's got his belts over his shoulder as well. So there's that sign of achievement there. Not just someone to be proud of because of his bravery, but actually he's won these things as well for the town. I think boxers in Merthyr as well. Merthyr's a tough place. The industries that the town grew up around, iron and steel, these are hard-working, tough environments. So the fact you would have a boxer, a really tough sport, or boxers would be an image of the town, makes sense. And again, the plinth works well with that as well. That's a big lump of hard stone, isn't it? There's delicate about that plinth. It's hard and rough, and he's sat on top of it. So I like that.
Is there anything to say with respect to Howard Winston? Just going back to Johnny Owen for a moment. Johnny's got his gloves on. Howard doesn't. It's almost more of like it is magisterial, but it's almost that sense of this is post-fight, post-battle. This is kind of downtime. This is relaxing. This is reflecting. Whereas Johnny's very much in a pose. Interesting contrast there.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult with sports statues. I mean, this is a conversation I had with Philip Jackson, who I referred to earlier, who's sort of one of the UK's top sculptors. And he was very vehement on the subject that somehow figurative sculpture, particularly sports sculpture, was considered low art. He thought this was very unfair because he said it's actually really hard. Doing a sports sculpture is hard because if I'm doing the Queen, she's got a dress on. I don't have to do her legs. I don't really have to do much shaping of the body at all. She's got a big baggy dress on. But if I'm doing a sports person, footballer, boxer, whatever, then I've got to get everything right. The legs matter, the knees matter, the feet matter, the whole body matters. So there is a lot of skill in trying to just get the figure as it is, get that right. Now, the added thing with the sports sculpture, of course, is that the public know these people as action men. They don't know them as static things. They know them in the ring. So you've got a difficult choice to make when you're choosing a design for a sports person. Do you go for an action shot, as with Johnny Owen, throwing a punch? But the problem there is, even though the pose he's in will be an action pose, he is still static in the statue. And there's that contradiction there. Or you can play it slightly safer, go with something like Howard Winston, where you go for him in a posed thing. So there isn't that contradiction between the fact that he is a lump of bronze and therefore can't move, and he's sitting there. So you can just see both sides of the coin there.
So let's complete the triumvirate in Merthyr. So she's not quite in the town centre. It's just on the outskirts, I suppose, at Bethesda Gardens.
Yeah.
What I like about this one is that, and it was drawn to my attention by a friend of mine in Merthyr. Again, it's more of an action shot, gloves on, so a bit more akin to Johnny Owen. Eddie Thomas was from an earlier sort of era of boxing. I think I'm right in saying as well that he became quite successful in business after he finished his own career, and he's sort of striking that kind of left jab is in the direction of Merthyr council offices.
Okay.
Somebody drew to my attention, and there was always the wonder that was perhaps a little bit, it was orientated in that way a little bit more intentionally, because of that. But I don't know, I've not been able to get to the bottom of that. But and again, some of the more biographical information, but through in a very, very small area at all in Merthyr.
I think this is interesting. I don't know much about Eddie Thomas, but I'm going to guess that his signature punch was a left jab, basically. And it's a way that statues can create that collective memory beyond the life of the person who's being depicted. And there's several sports statues around the UK where you get someone depicted in a particular pose, and people in the future will see that and they'll think of that person in that pose, even though they never saw them play. And that's, I think, the way that statues can create that memory in people who haven't even had that first-hand memory is a very interesting point. This is the plinth for this is also a bit more elegant, isn't it? This one, almost more like a sort of a tombstone type.
Yeah.
Plenty of reference. If you scroll down to the inscription a second as well, there's this thing there: loved by the community, ideal ambassador for Merthyr, born in Merthyr, free man of Merthyr. When you get civic statues, what you will often see is plenty of references to the town that person's from, because of course one purpose of that statue, whether deliberate or not, is that it will bring honour to the town. It's not just about honour to that particular person.
Well, in Eddie Thomas's case, specifically the street, the Bachman Bar, the little boy of Collier's Row, which again, obviously, was where he was born, but again denotes the mining heritage of the town. Steel as well in Merthyr as well. People sometimes forget. But mentioned Thierry Henry earlier. So on that Arsenal theme, but we've got others to come before him a little bit. Tell us about Herbert Chapman.
Yes,
a very proud, noble pose.
I mean, these three Arsenal statues we're going to look at now are the classic stadium statues in the UK, at least in one respect. So, where we have statues in sports that are team sports tend to have their own stadium, and in the case of football and rugby, then we're talking about a large fan base, particularly football, a large fan base, a location a statue can be placed at, clubs who might be quite wealthy, and the possibility of doing a statue becomes far more easy to achieve. And that's why of the UK sports statues, I think, or not quite half of them, but we're getting to about 40-45% of them are to do with football. We're approaching around 100 football statues now in the UK. It's the most in the world, but there are other countries that have very sizable collections as well. And there are two ways football statues tend to be created. There are either fan campaigns, which tends to happen at smaller clubs, and we'll have a look at one of those later, or they are club-led projects. Where they're club-led projects, they are typically about branding that stadium environment and the club itself. They want to say something about the club and why people should support them. And there's been research to show that creating nostalgia in people, projecting a sense of the authenticity of the club, the history and the tradition of the club, that helps increase people's support for the club. You get someone who comes along and they see something that reminds them of their past, and when they used to support the club as a boy, they'll think, I want to go back there again to keep recreating my childhood. So Herbert Chapman is very much one about the authenticity of Arsenal, the tradition of Arsenal. A great manager from the 1930s, also a great innovator. And so he's a nod to Arsenal's past. If you look at the plinth of this, there's almost no inscription on it. All it says is Herbert Chapman, Arsenal manager, 1925 to 1934. It doesn't say anything about Herbert Chapman particularly. And I think that's quite clever. I think the idea is this statue works on two levels. It works on the level of, here's this famous figure, Herbert Chapman, who people, football fans would probably have heard about, but Arsenal fans in particular, they will know much more about this guy and why his importance. He's also looking up towards what's called the clock end of the new, well, it's not that new anymore, but the Emirates Stadium. Now, when the clock end was at Highbury, their old stadium, the innovation of having the clock was something that was to do with Herbert Chapman. And that was an unusual or a new thing in football at the time, having a clock in the ground that people would look at. So the idea, he's looking up at his idea. I mean, he was very innovative. There was ideas around floodlighting, managerial tactics. I think Arsenal strip, though I might get in trouble here if I've got this wrong, the idea of having the white sleeves to distinguish them from other teams who played in red. I think that was Herbert Chapman. Apologies, Arsenal fans, if I'm not correct on that.
Certainly, I think the striped socks was
striped socks.
So that you could. He felt the players, his team could basically more quickly identify teammates through not having to look up so elevated, just literally looking at the lower leg. I'm pretty sure that was a Chapman innovation. That lack of exposition, that was something that struck me when you sent these through. It's almost if you know, you know. And if you don't know, then you need to know. So go and do your homework. We're not going to tell you.
Or if you know, that shows you're a proper Arsenal fan. And that gives you that sense of credit. And that's particularly true with the next two Arsenal statues as well. I think perhaps even more so than Chapman, because to be fair, there aren't going to be many Arsenal fans alive who were fans when Chapman was manager, but there will be plenty who would be fans when Tony Adams was playing and Thierry Henry was playing. So we have Tony Adams here, and this is a particular pose celebrating a famous goal he scored in front of the North Bank in a big game. And so the statue has two dimensions. Again, the idea, Tony Adams, famous England international, he played for Arsenal. Isn't that great? What a hero he was. And then for the true Arsenal fan, wow, what a great moment that was. We remember that moment, and we remember that because we're Arsenal fans. We're proper Arsenal fans. And then Thierry Henry, if you just shift on to Thierry, he brings another dimension again. So Thierry Henry was the first statue in the UK of a black footballer. I think probably the first statue of an overseas player as well. And Thierry Henry, no disrespect to Tony Adams, but Thierry Henry was a world famous star. People from all over the world would know who Thierry Henry was for his exploits playing for France, winning the World Cup, the Euros. And the location of the Emirates Stadium is very near the centre of London. So it has become a sports tourist destination. So if you wander around the Emirates for daytime, you will see little groups of people from who are clearly tourists, Japan, China, America, etc., with their cameras out, taking photos of the Thierry Henry statue. And by having this statue of a famous international player, it's a very good way of marketing Arsenal. We're basically saying, Thierry Henry, he was an Arsenal player, this great hero. Look at this. But the pose adds something for the true fans. I think be very careful here what I say, but for the long-standing Arsenal fans, the people who are already fans. So the statue appeals to, hopefully attracts new fans from tourists, but it also appeals to people who are existing Arsenal fans and their sense of authenticity as a fan, because the pose is a particular goal where he'd scored against Spurs, I think, and then he'd run all the way to the other end of the pitch and slid on his knees in front of the Arsenal fans. So that particular pose is very important, but you'd have had to have been at that game or know about that game to be able to interpret that part of it. It won't matter to sports tourists that they can't interpret that. They'll just say Thierry Henry, great player, and that will work for them. So it's the idea of multivalence, the idea that a statue can carry different messages for different people. And that's really clear here. Now, there are three statues together there, and there's a fourth one of Dennis Bergkamp. They were actually all part of a project instigated by Arsenal Football Club called Arsenalisation. So when they moved to the Emirates Stadium, They moved from this historic ground, Highbury, probably in design-wise, architecture-wise, the most notable UK football ground, most recognisable, an absolute classic stadium. And they moved to this new, effectively blank canvas. All the little quirks, the little logos, the Art Deco style of Highbury, all gone. And you've moved to this basically concrete bowl. And there was complaints almost immediately from the fans that this doesn't feel like home. So Arsenal very much set out to try and make it feel like home. And part of that process was to add statues of heroes around the outside, as well as lots of murals and banners, cladding around the stadium. And that's the way statues are often used. It's very much, there's an analogy with the civic statues. You've got a boring looking shopping centre with the same shops everywhere else in the country. How do you give your town identity? Put a local sports hero up. You've moved into a blank canvas of a stadium, no real things to say it's your stadium apart from the colour of the seats. How do you make it feel like your stadium? Put a statue up, because that's a particular figure that's important to the identity of your club.
So let's drop a division or two down the Football League. We'll head to Port Vale.
Yeah, okay, so Port Vale.
Now, even non-footballing fans would probably have some understanding and recognition of the name Thierry Henry, Tony Adams, Dennis Bergkamp, for example. Royce Broson, arguably not, with all due respect.
No, definitely not, no.
But even to football fans,
unless you're a Vale fan or you're from Stoke or you're knowledgeable about football, you won't have heard of Royce Broson.
Yeah.
He made 837 appearances for Port Vale. So he's an interesting example of subject selection. Thierry Henry is very much the outlier compared to Royce Broson in this sense. If you look at statues at football clubs, they tend to be of players who played a lot of games for that club. Loyalty is a really important predictor. They also tend to be players who played maybe 30 years before the statue was unveiled. Thierry Henry is a real outlier in that sense. Henry actually ended up playing in the stadium while his statue was outside. That's pretty much unique, certainly in the UK. Whereas Royce Broson retired sort of in the 1960s, I think. And the statue was eventually went up in 2012, but the project had been going on for about 10, 15 years. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I mean, these sort of statues are about celebrating loyalty, and they're about nostalgia of 40-something, 50-something fans for their childhood. And Royce Broson will be part of that childhood. This is also a really good example of a fan-funded statue. So I mentioned that Arsenal Football Club put the statues up around the Emirates. Port Vale Football Club haven't got the money just to throw out 40, 50,000 on a statue. But what Port Vale do have, and what makes English football almost unique, is it's the level of support in the lower divisions. You go to a fourth tier game in Germany, some of those clubs will be attracting 500, 600 people. You go to a fourth tier game in the UK, it's probably 4,000 or 5,000 people. And there's been a growth in the recent years of supporters' trust, independent supporters associations, partly due to the financial crisis a lot of these clubs have. But when they're not having a financial crisis, there's that spare capacity to do something else. And one thing these supporters associations look to do is mark the history of their club. It's important to them. And one way of doing that is organising a statue. So Port Vale supporters got together and started a project to celebrate Royce Broson. Obvious choice, by far their greatest player in the sense of appearances made, played in many of their greatest games. How are we going to do a statue of Royce Broson? Well, the club aren't going to pay. We're going to have to raise the money ourselves. And it took them about 10 years to raise the money. And that's a long time to keep going. It's very easy to give up. Oh, we've only got 2,000, we've only got 5,000, and we're 3 years in. We're not going to do it, are we? We're never going to get to 50, 60,000. But no, they kept going and going and going. Little bits here and there, fundraising dinners, bucket collections, selling merchandise. And they got there in the end. It's fantastic to see. And it's a really cool design as well. You don't get so many statues of players heading the ball, but Royce Broson was a defender. And that's what centre-backs do in the UK. They head the ball. Well, they did in those days. So
It was either that or kick an attacker up in the air.
yes, kick an attacker. You can't
The
really
way
do a statue of that.
Yeah, the way he's stepping off the plinth, I think, that's quite interesting as well. And I'm trying to think, I can't think of too many of that nature.
Not many in the UK, no.
What's interesting as well, the inscriptions also commemorate more the Sproson family as much as Roy himself and other Sprosons that played for Port Vale, which is interesting as well. Yeah, you mentioned playing lots of games. I know Fred Keener outside the new Cardiff City, well, again, not so new Cardiff City Stadium. He would be Cardiff's Roy Sproson then, I guess.
Yeah, and there are lots of these characters. If you look in the lower divisions, these are the guys who tend to get statues, particularly. Even in the higher divisions, that tends to be the case. So yeah.
You mentioned the importance of Thierry Henry for being a black athlete.
Yeah.
In statue form. Laurie Cunningham, a little bit more recent unveiling. Tell us a bit more about this one.
Okay, so I mean, this is part of a trend that actually started in the US. In the US, racial discrimination against black sports people was far more severe in the UK. Make that clear. In the major leagues, there were no black players allowed to play. They had separate leagues for black players until like the 1940s and 50s. So that wasn't quite the case in the UK. It wasn't quite that bad. And in the US, they've had a number of statues attempting to make reparations for this, commemorating black players who would have been famous, or barrier breakers, the first black players to make it in the major leagues. Now, in the UK, there was a trickle of black players in the 1950s and 60s in football, but really the big breakthrough came in the 1970s. It's the point at which the children of West Indian immigrants in the 1950s, the Windrush generation, their children grown up with football, and these lads start to break through. And one of these early black players who broke through was Laurie Cunningham, most famous perhaps for playing for West Brom. As part of their great team, they had Laurie Cunningham, Cyril Regis, Brendan Batson, and there's actually a statue of the three of them together in West Bromwich now as well. But this Laurie Cunningham actually started in London at Leyton Orient. That was his first club before he went to West Brom. And this is a chance for, I think this was part funded by Leyton Council, part funded by Orient, but it's a chance for them to celebrate the fact that Laurie Cunningham started there. And there is a sense that it's these organisations saying, we were one of the first to give a chance to black players, and there's credit for us in that. Obviously, it's celebrating Laurie Cunningham as well. I don't want to take away from that, and rightly so. And it's great that they've done it, but you will often see what I would almost call sort of tolerance branding, that organisations who were amongst the earlier organisations to have black players playing for them will make a big deal of that. And the inscription on this is great though. The quote, "If I can get through this, maybe it will lead to others getting a chance," which talks really about the prejudice black players suffered in the late 70s, early 80s, booing from the fans. And I remember Laurie Cunningham playing in a famous game for West Brom at Old Trafford, where he ran them ragged. And they won. West Brom won 5-3, and you could hear the booing when they got the ball. And him and Cyril Regis just ran rings around them. It was great.
Yeah, and like Johnny Owen died tragically young.
Died tragically young in a car crash. Over in Spain, because he went to Real Madrid but suffered injuries. Never really fulfilled his potential. Laurie Cunningham, most graceful footballer. He just skipped past challenges. One of those players. It's just poetry in motion to watch.
Yeah.
And on pitches, of course, that were nothing like today. I mean,
no.
It was like basically running through glue.
Yeah, good point. So we spent a bit of time on football and boxing.
Yeah. Something completely different.
Bit of a departure. Yeah, we're going to go to rowing. Clasper.
I mean, forgotten histories is something that statues can reawaken. And if you go back to the 1870s, sort of just before the FA Cup starts, 1860s, 1870s, what's the biggest sport in the UK? Certainly the one that attracts the biggest crowds, rowing. So, you would get crowds in the 100,000 down at the Thames or the Tyne to watch rowing matches. lots of money being bet in the pubs alongside the river. And this was the era of the great Tyneside rowers. Now, they weren't commemorated in modern times. These are some of our first sports statues, and they're grave statues. When the Tyneside rowers died, statues were put up on their gravestones. So this is Harry Clasper, died in 1871, and I think he died in 1870. I think the statue was put up on his gravestone a year later. And yeah, he was one of the three great Tyneside rowers, Robert Chambers, and I can't remember the third one. You'll have to look on the website to see. But there's these three grave statues, and they're fantastic, made out of stone. Not in great state of repair, though they have had some work done on them recently to try and restore them a bit. And there was actually a play about Harry Clasper done to sort of keep his memory alive in recent years. But we forget, we always think in the present, we think it's always the case that football is the big sport, but actually it's not always been the case. There have been times when other sports were the big sport in the UK. And there was this period where rowing was the biggest sport and the top rowers were superstars. These were your celebrities of the day. And
in this respect, the statue here and your inclusion of it on the database is a way of maybe reminding people or
I hope so, yeah.
Correcting those misconceptions.
Yeah.
To what extent, Chris, does it matter that it's on a grave? It's the first one of the ones we've looked at now that are on a grave. That doesn't matter to you and the criteria and things?
No, it doesn't matter to me in the criteria at all. It's a different interpretation. Obviously, you're going to have fewer members of the public walking around the graveyard than you will on the high street. But you've got to be careful of over-interpreting grave statues. I mean, they can often be more reflective of the culture around death at the time, as opposed to the person depicted. So if you go to Eastern Europe, almost all the statues of footballers in Eastern Europe are grave statues. There's two reasons for that. Number one, you don't put a statue up of anybody's alive in Eastern Europe because it's considered a curse. They were thinking, if you do that, that person thinks, I think I'm going to die. They wouldn't like that. Secondly, there's a culture in the Eastern Orthodox Church that you put an image of someone on their gravestone. And people, even just general members of the public, have a little photo perhaps on the grave, which is pinned on the grave or something. But if you're really famous and you've got enough people to put the cash in, then you might get a statue on your grave. Now, if you look in Victorian cemeteries in the UK, there was a bit of a culture of that as well in the UK in those times. You get a lot more ornate gravestones or tombs being produced in the Victorian era in the UK than you do now. I mean, they've run out of space in many graveyards. The cost of it would be too great. So people tend to have much simpler things in some respects. Though you do tend to get these images, I think, or things for graves of children these days, teddy bears and things like that on them.
And as well, I suppose, because it's in a graveyard, because it's commemorating someone who's passed, you're less like, you're more likely to get that more sort of somber pose than, for example, Tony Adams, arms out.
Yeah,
I guess.
There is some truth to that, but actually the other Tyneside rower statues, one of them actually has the guy rowing.
Okay.
Robert Chambers one. The third one has the rower, whose name I can't remember. It has him, it is somber because he died actually having a heart attack while rowing. So it's got him collapsed in the arms of his co-rower.
Right, okay.
So yes and no is the answer. Okay. You can get action photos on gravestones. And again, in Eastern Europe, I've seen some incredible statues of footballers on their gravestones. There's one doing a Thierry Henry pose on his knees, actually, on the tombstone. So
we talked about boxers and being those very kind of those individuals going into the ring, and yes, they've got a bit of a team around them, and they might have a lot of fans in the in the auditorium cheering them on. But I mean, it's almost the epitome of that solitary sport. Athletics, to a certain extent, is you against everybody else, and yes, you're representing your country, representing community. but maybe not to the same extent as it's seen as that kind of
Mm.
individual sport as boxing is. So perhaps I don't know whether that explains why there's proportionately sort of fewer of them, unless of course there isn't. But Greg Rutherford, of course, is a much more recent, in recent memory, a much more recent kind of athlete.
Yeah. It's unusual. I mean, his current claim, didn't he win MasterChef the art years ago? He should have a picture of a statue.
That's why the statue's commemorating.
I mean, I love this statue, despite many things. It says a lot about sports statues, and yet it is very different to many sports statues. The thing that it says it has in common with many sports statues is the location. So it's in Milton Keynes. Now, you tend to get statues in new stadiums because they're blank canvases. You need to give identity. You tend to get them in new shopping precincts because they're blank canvases, give them identity. And you tend to get more statues in new towns because, again, blank canvas, identity needed. Milton Keynes, the ultimate new town of the 1950s. And it's full of art of different kinds, most famously the concrete cows. But it's not surprising that you've got something like this popping up in Milton Keynes, not just because Greg Rutherford hails from those parts, but would many other local authorities have come up with the money to put something this dramatic on a roundabout? Probably not. I mean, Milton Keynes has got a lot of roundabouts as well, so that helps. It's a whole city of roundabouts, but they like to decorate all of them. The statue itself, obviously, not typical at all because it isn't realist. Greg Rutherford doesn't have bits of metal coming out the back of his legs, and he doesn't quite jump that high, and his body hasn't got a lot of holes in it. It's not a realist statue. It's figurative, but it's an element of abstract there. But it's very dramatic, and a lot of the time you get sports statues that are inside shopping precincts or up against the side of a big stadium, and they can look a little bit lost, whereas this, it's never going to look lost. It rises above the landscape. So it's a really good piece of art, I think.
We've to date in this only covered statues in Wales and England. We're going to be getting to Scotland in a bit, I think. But before we do, another athlete. Steve Ovett.
So another Olympian. This one for me is about the permanence or the non-permanence of statues. People always assume that statues are this permanent thing. Once you put one up, they'll be there forever. Unless you're Edward Colston, of course. And I guess that story about the Colston statue is a reminder they're not really permanent. But Steve Ovett's statue story, again, is along those lines, not because he was pulled down and thrown in the harbour for any past indiscretions, but because statues are actually worth money. The bronze is worth money, and they do get stolen and broken up. And that's what happened to Steve Ovett's statue. So great English runner, sort of the yin to Sebco's yang in the 1980s. Ovett, the slightly left-wing, rebellious type, compared to Coe, the very establishment man. Quite appropriate that Steve Ovett's statue is from Brighton, statues in Brighton, and that's a slightly rebellious left-wing alternative-y town. It fits really well. But anyway, the statue was put up in 1987, and then 20 years later, someone came along, sawed it off at the ankle, then tried to smash it up on site and set fire to it very amateurishly. They tried to set fire to it on site to melt it down. Failed to do much of this, just leaving a wreckage of bits of bronze. So yeah, it was destroyed. And then a little bit later, if you got the next one queued up, they got the you haven't what happened with Steve Ovett was they managed to recreate a new statue in the same pose, and it's now on the Brighton seafront, a better place. You're less likely to be smashed up there because it's under the gaze of the public, whereas the original statue was in a park, was hidden away a bit. easier to damage it. So yeah, you can't assume these things are permanent, even though they feel permanent.
No. Okay, let's go to the Isle of Skye.
It's absolute favourite of mine. This would be in my top 3.
Okay, I was gonna ask
statues,
you towards the end to give us a short list, but tell us a bit more about Colin Mackenzie.
So Colin Mackenzie. So this is on the Isle of Skye, and in the Isle of Skye there's a mountain range called the Cuillins, and they're pretty much unlike anything else in the UK. So pretty much any other hill in the UK you can put on your walking boots and just keep walking, you get to the top. If you've got the persistence, you can do it. The Cuillin Mountains are different. They actually involve some technical climbing skill to get to the top, and as such they were the last British mountains to be climbed. And this guy Norman Colley, an Englishman, came up, and he was interested in climbing, and he got a local guide called John Mackenzie, and they set about ticking off being the first ascents of several of these summits. They discovered a lot about the Cuillins, and it was nice. There was this friendship developed between them, this quite posh guy from England, Norman Colley, and then this local, he was a ghillie. A ghillie is someone who's like a gamekeeper, a local ghillie, John Mackenzie. And they worked together really very well, apparently, in the hills. Now, a place, putting a statue outdoors can be quite controversial. Some people who go out walking or climbing don't like to see anything on the landscape apart from the natural landscape. So I was quite surprised when this was put up. It's a statue of Colin Mackenzie pointing towards the mountain, or looking towards the mountains effectively. It's just on the main road going through Skye, a place called Slegachen. There's a hotel there. And it's a place anyone coming onto Skye would drive past. I'm not sure whether it's particularly acts as something that would lure people to come to Skye, because I think people even know, if they know about the statue, they know about the mountains already. But as a reminder of the fact that, I mean, climbing or mountaineering, as I think I should probably call this the sport here, mountaineering. Mountaineering of a sport is ignored apart from a very strong subculture who do it. The public wouldn't necessarily think of mountaineers as sports people, but actually the physical skills, the bravery, just because you're not competing against anyone else, you're competing against the mountain, doesn't mean it's not a sport. And it's nice to see these figures being honoured, because they were the first people to go up there, and it's pretty dangerous up there. I've been up to a few of the summits, and in the 1800s, you didn't have Gore-Tex, you didn't have lightweight climbing shoes, you didn't have lightweight gear. You were going up in hobnail boots with rope that probably wasn't that good. And yeah, proper brave and quite inspiring, really, what they did.
Okay, we're on the home run. This will be a fairly famous posture and pose, won't it, I suppose? And again, an athlete who would be in people's consciousness, whether they're interested in the sport or not. And it's
absolutely, yeah. Yeah, okay. I mean, a lot of sports statues in the UK commemorate a person for their lifetime achievements, for their general sporting hero-ness. Whereas this statue is very much about a moment. I mean, it's not so much about Dittori, the jockey, as such, but it's about this one-off moment where he rode 7 out of 7 winners on the race card, which is something that's never been done before or since. If you consider I mean, you're relying on your horse quite a lot if you're a jockey, even if you get on the 7 best horses for the day, which he wasn't. A couple of them weren't that great. The odds on actually bringing them all home in first place so it was, I think, 25,000 to 1.
Yeah, it says.
And it says on it says that on the thing. I remembered. So yeah, it's about that moment. I think it's it's a good piece of branding by Ascot Racecourse, because you want to try and get people to bet on stuff, and you see that and you think, well, 25,000 to 1. Well, if I put my money on that, maybe someone will do it today. Let's go and put my money on each of Frankie's races, or whoever the top jockey is now. So it's quite clever, really. And it's, I mean, it's a feat that is worth recognising as a one-off.
And a bit like the Tony Adams one, it's a representation of a specific image that it's fairly iconic, isn't it? He leaps off the
leaping dismount, flying dismount off the horse. He literally can somehow able to just jump off a horse. How you do that? I mean, I wouldn't get on one, but
no. As a slight aside, as I was looking through these, the inscription obviously gives the date of that achievement, and I'm just stunned that it's as long ago as 1996.
I know. I remember when it happened.
That's aged me a little bit. Yeah.
Right. Kelly Holmes. So this is statues as commercial opportunities. So, and it's also when statues go wrong. So this was erected by Shaw Deodorant. Okay. And it was erected just before the Olympics. So the idea was it's basically an advertising ploy by Shaw Deodorant to associate themselves with the Olympics. But obviously to do stuff with the Olympics and use the Olympic brands, you probably have to pay huge amounts of money. So another way of trying to somehow associate themselves with the Olympics was to create a figure of a former Olympian. Kelly Holmes had won us a few gold medals in the past. So they did this statue of Kelly Holmes and they stuck it up in the centre of London. And I think the idea was that it was going to go to her hometown after Shaw had milked the publicity of sticking it up in London. And actually, the statue was so bad that the reaction in the newspapers was completely negative. I mean, the sort of media storm about it, Twitter storm. This is a dreadful statue. It looks like Jessica Ennis more than Kelly Holmes, etc., etc. And it's quietly disappeared. But it's an interesting one. There has been a few of these sort of statues that have been created by advertising agencies. A few of the betting companies have done ones of football managers. Paddy Power, I think they did one of Roy Hodgson on the White Cliffs of Dover, something like that. Odd. Just a temporary one. And Adidas did one of Frank Ribéry, the French player. And there was another bookmaker one. I think, yes, they did a picture of they did a statue of David Moyes. Paddy Power did a statue of David Moyes when he was Man United manager, put it outside Anfield with some sort of joke saying Liverpool's best signing. So people are starting to use statues as commercial advertising, not in the sort of some more subtle branding way, but in a really overt way. But it does show that if you're going to do a statue, you've got to at least make a bit of an effort to get it to look like the person. Otherwise, it can backfire. I'm not sure the publicity that Shaw Deodorant got from this was what they actually wanted. I think they got quite a lot of stick for it. So, yeah, I suppose you could say any publicity is good publicity, but
yeah, but when statues go wrong, as you say, you mentioned Colin Mackenzie being in one of your favourites. I mean, can I press you on maybe top 3, top 5? What would be your
top
pick?
3 of top 5 statues? Wow. Okay. I like Bob Stokoe at Sunderland. He's skipping along. It's a flashbulb memory, or rather a video memory, as it were, when Sunderland won the FA Cup in 1973. He did a little jig on the pitch, and the statue captures that. So rather than capturing a moment of actual sporting triumph, it's a moment of celebration, which is quite good. Yes, I like Colin Mackenzie. And I've got a personal one. I'm a Watford fan, so the Graham Taylor statue at Watford's tremendous. He's sitting on a bench, and again, as a Watford fan, you would understand that more than anyone else, because when Graham Taylor was manager, he refused to have a dugout with a roof until the home fans had a roof over the terrace at the end. So we just sat out in the rain on a bench every game. He said, I'm not going to have it be in comfort if the fans can't be in comfort. And they left a space on the bench so you can go and sit next to him and have your photo taken. So it's interactive in a way that a statue stuck up on a plinth isn't. So I think that's a tremendous one as well. That's partly personal, but Bob Stoker, yeah,
the Bob Stoker one.
Very good. There's a lot of good stories about this. I mean, the sculptor got a naked man to run about a room skipping, and he took photos of him from all different angles just to get the pose right. And there's a watch on his wrist, and the time on it it was supposed to be set at the particular time when it was the final whistle, but I think there's something wrong about the way the time's been set. Either it's on the wrong wrist or the clock's not quite right or something. So it shows that in little details. I mean, fans find little details incredibly important. You've got to get those little things just right.
Yeah. That statue could have turned out completely different based on how it was designed.
Yes, absolutely.
With a naked chap running around.
Yeah,
Chris,
I know.
It's been an absolute pleasure. How do people sort of keep in touch, or how do people get in touch? How do they keep up to date with progress of the project?
Well, we've got a website, www.sportingstatues.com, which you can visit anytime. You can look at over 1,000 statues. We've got about 700 football statues around the world, all of the UK sports statues, all of the world's cricket statues, and all of North America's baseball statues as well. So if you like a bit of overseas sport, there's that for you there.
Yeah.
We're also on Twitter @sportingstatues and regularly tweet things or retweet new statues that have been produced. And we're always on the lookout for information. So if you know of a statue that we haven't got, or a photo we're missing, or a plinth inscription that we're missing, then that would be great as well if you could get in touch. We think we've got all the UK's ones, but we're quite happy to be surprised. I did find one in Liverpool the other day that we hadn't actually got. It was a bit shameful. The other thing is there's lots of publications on the website. There's a few short films, and I'm more than happy to send out copies of all the publications, magazine articles, etc., if you get in touch with us.
Excellent, Chris. It's been a real pleasure. Indulged myself a little bit as well. You've included some of my personal favourites, so I'm grateful for that. To Fionn as well for her input. Last week, myself and Derek, people from Sport and Heritage, were in Deganwy in North Wales, listening to Sir Gareth Edwards, speak about his career and an iconic try that he scored 50 years ago, almost to the day, against Scotland for Wales in 1972. And it was interesting because, of course, I knew this was in the diary, this talk, and Gareth Edwards' statue, which is in the St David's Shopping Centre in Cardiff City Centre, was probably the first statue of this kind of type,
certainly one of the very early ones. Yeah, absolutely.
But also that I was aware of, and I can remember my asking my dad, well, who's this chap, basically, and it being explained, and quite how iconic not only he was as a player, but also the esteem in which he was held, by rugby fans across the world. And I think at that point, considered, one of, if not the best to have played the game at that point.
Yeah.
And again, just echoes a lot of what we've covered. It's very much a sporting pose. It's him as a scrum half about to pass the ball. It's in a shopping centre, so very prominent and so on. But fascinating. So it brought back a little bit of my childhood as well, just listening to him, knowing this was coming up.
I mean, that's one of the joys of sports statues, and one of the good things that come out of them. I mean, the reasons behind them might often be about branding and trying to attract more, increase fans' loyalty. But what they do is enable generations to connect with each other. So your dad was talking about Gareth Edwards to you, even though you hadn't seen him play at that point. I remember a great story. It's a very good one to finish on, really. They put a statue up at Charlton Athletic of Sam Bartram, who was their great goalkeeper. And I remember the guy who organised it said to me that they were just collecting money from the fans, and this little lad came up, and Sam Bartram played the 1950s, so this lad would not have seen him play. He was about 6. and he gave a pound coin to the guy organising, and he goes, "This is for the Sam statue." And the idea that fans from all generations can contribute to these things, and you get these where people say, "I'll meet you at the statue." So people might meet by the statue before the game, and there might be a grandfather there and a grandson, and the grandfather can say to the son, "I saw this guy play. He was a real hero. He's like the star of today for you. This guy was for me." And the history of the club can be passed down the generations in that way.
Yeah. No, lovely story. So thanks once again, Chris, for your time and for joining us as part of the Art of Sporting Heritage Month, #Sport and Art. Get involved. It's online. It's across all social media. Follow that hashtag. There's draw-alongs. There's seminars. There's webinars. There's sort of Twitter hours with guest artists and sports people taking part as well as a few more talks like this as well. So please get involved.